Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is episode 15 in the series 21st-Century Children. In the modern world, there appears to be greater competition between the family and the environment as the places where children are best reared. 21st-century children need more help and more effective participation with their families. In this episode, learn how culture affects us and our children, and learn how to make your family have more influence.
When we are talking about 21st century children, we're actually talking about the fact that children live in an environment or a culture or a world that unless the conditions in the environment can be limited or regulated in some way, then the conditions external to the family are a little more hostile and maybe in some cases a great deal more hostile to the successful growth of our children. This applies specifically if parents are a religious family attempting to help their children develop an unshakable faith in the God they worship, or if you're an educational family where you want your children motivated to achieve academically, or if there are certain kinds of social skills and abilities and attitudes toward people, namely moral thought and moral actions, then the world in which your children live in today, they find a greater need for the family unit to be a stronger, more cohesive unit, providing them with help, education, and opportunity so they as children can grow into the mature, responsible, very successful adults that their parents, who are very wise, hope for them to be. Now, does that mean that there are all sorts of negative possibilities available for our children? Yes, it does. Does it mean that the American family is less likely to provide the kind of socializing that children benefit from? In some instances, yes. But it does not mean that there are many parents and families who are moving to locations or organizing themselves so that they provide a more wholesome and positive environment for their children. There are large numbers of parents who've looked at the situation and said, gee, we need to so-called circle the wagons so that we provide a greater opportunity for our kids. This is the explanation behind the increase in homeschooling and the increase in work climates and schedules so that one or both parents can spend more time with the kids. Now, I'd like to give you a few examples of what the research, like surveys and other types of behavioral science research is suggesting to us. First of all, we have a greater incidence in crime. We have an earlier exposure and addiction to pornography. And while the suicide results go up and down in a little bit of pattern of cycles, it's still way too high. One's too high, too many. And so we are now looking at the situation thinking, all right, we have a great potential in parents who love their kids and organize their families. And we also have a lot of things taking place in our environment that frighten us. And in my opinion, it should. So what is it that 21st century children need? In my opinion, they need parents who are wiser about how culture influences their children and how the family can socialize their children so that they can take steps to take advantage of all the wonderful benefits that the culture provides and at the same time limit their children's exposure to the things that might be a detriment to them. So in this episode, I'm going to cover two areas: the role of culture in how children develop and grow, and the role of family as a socializer. Socializer means how the family influences the social, emotional, and academic and moral behavior of their children. My purpose is to remind you, you probably already know this, and just a reminder, but if you don't know about it, then you can learn a little bit about the role culture plays and why it plays a certain amount of influence in the lives of children and families, and also the role of families as a socializer in promoting the growth and development of successful children. First, I'd like to give you an example of the type of research that's been going on actually for 3 or 4 decades about this central question. Just does how culture influence families and therefore influence kids. So one researcher from McGill University in Canada did a really interesting, intriguing kind of study. The idea was that she would take a look at how much information and what kind it was that would got into the family by going to the family and identifying how open the family was or receptive to kinds of information that came from the world around them. So she identified three types. One family admitted very little information, didn't subscribe to magazines, didn't go out, didn't take their children, didn't expose them to places. And so we get a certain kind of family that has restricted levels of information from the environment. A second type of family emerged where the families had specific projects, she called them, and these projects defined what the parents allowed or brought into the family. So, for example, if you were a religious family, as parents, you'd bring into the home information about the religious concepts or ideas that are in your life. If you were an academic family, you would bring information and do things inside your family to promote that. Pretty self-evident. The third type of family was the family that was very open to almost anything, including experimental lives, including things that they had contact with in the world around them. And in our case, today, we would say they were pretty open to whatever television and movies brought, for example, without screening them. Type 2 families would probably screen some of them, and Type 1 families might not even admit their children the internet into their home, for example. What she learned was very interesting to me. In the first kind of family, or Type 1, she discovered that the parenting patterns typically were very authoritarian, where they set the rules, they enforced the rules. Sometimes they were harsh with the kids to make rules and to make kids follow them. The Type 2 families, the parenting tended to be more democratic or authoritative, where the parents were experts, involved the kids and so on, and had more of a shared experience with the children. And the third type of family, the parents tended to be fairly permissive. They were not all involved with their children very often. They talked to their kids and said, hey, come and talk to me about that, whatever you're experimenting with, and so on. Now you can imagine from that type of research, the idea that conditions from the environment does in fact influence children and how they develop and grow. And you can also learn that families can have a role in deciding how to participate in the culture or how not to, as the case may be. So now let's consider the culture and child development, and to take a look at how researchers are considering that the culture around your family exerts influence on the family and therefore your children. So we begin with the idea that usually as children grow, their understanding expands from the parent-child relationship to the immediate family, to an extended family, to their friends in the neighborhood, to their town or city, to their state and to their country, and of course then to the world. As their participation in the activities of growing up increases, their understanding of their culture also increases. Family, media, church, schools, and friends transmit information about culture and how to participate in it. Child development is, therefore, influenced by culture. To fully understand how your children grow and how to promote their growth, it is useful for you to be knowledgeable about how children develop in a cultural context. So what does culture mean? Every culture has common ingredients. Each has a language and a system of communication, kinship relationships, customs and traditions, some forms of government, formal laws, which govern everyone, and informal rules, which, though unspoken, exert considerable influence over how people act. In addition, the laws or rules in any culture are reinforced by what are called approval or disapproval mechanisms. When children comply, they receive approval, and when they don't, they receive disapproval. Examples of approval may be affection and attention, and disapproval may include shunning, family punishment, and imprisonment. A culture may have one or more religions which serve the purpose of giving direction to desirable behavior. The people in any culture may share some characteristics in common, for example, language, but differ from one another in other respects. This is diversity. To understand culture, therefore, we must appreciate how diverse and how similar are in the peoples in the culture. In the context made up of these cultural elements, children are born and reared. Their early family experiences are principally designed to teach them how to later participate in each aspect of their culture, whether they intentionally do that or not. They learn language, for example, and participate in kinship relationships with their relatives. They learn how to participate in the customs of their culture. They discover approval and disapproval mechanisms and learn about conforming or non-conforming behaviors. They may also have experiences with fads and fashions which change, as you know, from time to time. The extent of a culture's influence on children depends upon how much or how well children participate in activities which are part of the cultural tradition. I would also like to point out what kind and how often. If a child cannot use language well, for example, he or she may not be able to benefit from the learning or training experiences of the culture in which the language is a part. Consider also the idea that education is a means of transmitting culture. If a child does not participate meaningfully in educational activities, participation in the culture may be limited. And in fact, some parents, as I mentioned, actually intend to do that. Now consider with me the idea that since children are growing up in some kind of a culture, restricted or organized according to projects or just open and anything can occur, take a new look at the role of the internet and electronic devices and realize that even though they're heavily restricted, where maybe a 12 or 13-year-old could just make telephone calls or receive calls or something else like send text messages, they still increase the amount of cultural involvement in the family. And when they are not restricted and a child has a smartphone, for example, the entire world of information then becomes available to and often predatory to our children. Now, to examine how culture, though, influences children specifically, let's examine how there are notions about child development in every culture. Like any value, a culture will have some values or attitudes about child rearing and child care. These are taught in educational settings, demonstrated in methods of child care, and presented in the media. For example, Japanese parents are more likely to keep their children physically close to them than parents from the United States do during the first 3 years of life. In the U.S., we value individuality and often treat our children in this manner. We also share some concept of what is good parenting or bad parenting, and in any culture, when people demonstrate incompetent parenting, they receive disapproval from other cultural members. In similar ways, may be approved of for the parenting, just like people are approved or disapproved of for other forms of behavior. Beyond the foregoing, culture and child development are related in other ways. For example, the members of each culture informally establish certain times when developmental milestones should be demonstrated. Anyone watching a child development will measure the developments by which these milestones are manifest and about the times expected. In the United States, 80% agree that the best age for a man to marry is between 20 and 25. That has changed in the last few years for up to 27 now. The best time for a woman between it used to be 19 through 24, and now it's to 25 to 27. The definition of a young man, for example, in our culture is someone between 17 and 23 and 24. And as another interesting variation on this theme, many people in the United States expect education, that is a college education, to end around the time of 25 to 26 years of age. For those who are just getting baccalaureate degrees and those who have more advanced degrees, it is moving to the late 20s and early 30s. Parents in any culture are aware of these milestones and will often attempt to prepare their children to meet them. And when children demonstrate the developmental milestones at the appropriate times, parents often feel more successful than when children do not. It is sometimes very difficult, for example, for a parent to take a look at their children and discern between early developing children who mature early by 12 or 13, and later developing kids who don't mature physically or emotionally till later adolescence. Now, all the participation in cultural events by parents and children tend to internalize these values and ideals into each person about themselves and about the culture itself. As a result, we get kind of a national personality where members of a given culture are collectively stereotyped. Europeans may think, for example, that Americans are rich, vulgar, and loud. Americans may think that Latin Americans are lazy, passionate, and not very intelligent or industrious enough to rise above poverty. And Europeans and Americans may think Asian people are shrewd, inscrutable, hardworking, and pagan, and culture often dictates these type of stereotypes. And if you think your children are free from those, please take a look at the studies which compare the attitudes children have as adults regarding other people and their parents' attitudes toward other people when the children were growing up. They tend to be very similar. Now, John Spielberg describes some of the cultural values as they affect personality or social development. He compared three nationalities, American, Asian, and Latin American. He compared their values according to authority, orientation toward time, and orientation toward nature. Now, why do this? Well, because orientation toward authority, that is, comply with, respected or not, orientation toward time, how much I value it, how organized is it, and so on, and orientation toward nature. Now, while the following has changed in recent years, I'm going to describe what he said as a comparison so that you can see the influence of different cultural backgrounds. In authority, for example, in the United States, we believe that we are highly individualistic, most of us. There is competition nowadays between group and individual freedoms and so on, but our central authority isn't even a maternal figure or a paternal figure like Russian is or Germany is. We have an Uncle Sam, and we do that because we believe in individualism. In Latin America, the authority patterns are less so, but used to be very autocratic, and they still are in most families. And in Asia, they have a group kind of authority where little groups get together and organize together and so on. And that's why, if you're ever at an airport, you'll see small groups of Asian people getting off the plane together, going and meet with business people together, and so on. Now let's take a look at Spielberg's notion of time. He said that in America, the idea is present to future. We're trying to take a look at what we're doing now and how to get to someplace. In Latin America, it tends to be a present orientation where whatever is going on right now is more important than what can be or what should happen. And then in the Asian culture, past to present tends to be very significant, where we're honoring things that have gone on in the past and we want to invoke the good parts of those in the present. I repeat, they've been changing over the last 20 years to something else. Where nature is concerned, our orientation toward it in America is to subdue it. So if we see in the past, if we've seen a river running free, somebody wants to put a dam in it and control it so we can get some electrical power. In Latin America, people believe that they're controlled by nature. A lot of the primitive religions, for example, in Spanish America and in Mexico in particular, have all to do with nature gods, sacrifice to this god or to that god. And in Asia, they believe that it's important to become in harmony with nature, so they teach their kids how to participate, how to grow, and how to live in harmony with the conditions nature supplies. Now, what's the purpose of all this? Well, it's to give you an idea that the culture around you, exerts influence on your family, and as parents of 21st century children, if that influence is more predatory, which it is in some environment, plus provides greater opportunities, then parents are going to need to be more selective about what they invite their children and their family to participate in. It is no longer the case, because of the internet largely, where families in our culture, or any culture for that matter, can be totally free or totally ignore the cultural influence, because schools are no longer the cooperative role or partner with parents. Sometimes schools and educational settings teach something very different than what parents want. Sometimes churches are like that, and sometimes government is like that. So with that in mind, then it's like, well, what do we do so that we make sure that we have a chance to have influence and on our children that will help our children turn out we would like? Now let's take a look at what the proponents of positive child development are concerned about, and that is to look at the family as a unit and how it socializes or educates their children. And by learning about this, then you may be able to say, okay, what are we doing in our family? What could we do better? And so on. Now, when a child's born, he or she is born not only into a family, but into a society. We know that. And each society has different rules and expectations for how it thinks its members should act. A child does not know these expectations when he or she is born and has to be taught while growing up. Now think about that for a minute. Historically, what we've done, as the family has been seen as the primary socializing agent to have our children turn out with the cultural values and the opportunities inside a culture that everybody appreciates. Well, now there are some values in our culture that we don't want, or many parents do not want their children to demonstrate. So now the family is different than the primary instrumental rule regarding our cultural effects. The family now is more like a unit that is designed to promote healthy psychological, emotional, and social development of the children so that it fits some set of values that the parents have in mind rather than matching up with the cultural values. So, for example, we might want to teach our children about acceptance and understanding so that they won't be biased or prejudiced in some way, but we are not interested in teaching our children how to participate fully in anti-government, anti-social, other kinds of crime, and other types of addictive forms of behavior that they can learn from the environment. So now our choice is interesting. We have to decide what we're going to do and how we're going to organize our families with that in mind. Now, as a child had parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents all living in close proximity years ago, they could organize their family and exert great influence. That model is still a good model, in my opinion, if the goal is not to help your children become successful externally, but to help your children become successful. Be selective about what is external in the environment, but also promote the important and successful values of healthy and wise parents. Now, because, in my opinion, this matters more than it used to, please consider the following major socializing agents. The family used to be one of several: friends, church, school, TV, magazines, government policies, cultural heritage, the internet, and electronic devices, and games, and etc. And then you ask yourself, wow, what does each one of those bring to the family for us that we want to take advantage of? And what in each of those socializing agents are things that we don't want to have happen there? So I'm asking you to learn to evaluate each of these socializers as to how much control a parent can have over them. Do you think a parent has no control, some control, or total control over each of them? Well, the reason you're doing this is because today's parents know their children are going to be exposed to messages and lifestyles different from what they teach in the home, and quite often parents panic. One of the most difficult things I see professionally is when parents become so anxious that they become too controlling, too critical, too demanding, hoping that they're going to save their children from some exposure to something bad. It would be better for us to all calm down and take a measured approach in how we're going about to socialize our kids. All right, so now that you're going along making your judgments, let me tell you what can happen. You can have near total control over the family if you want to. A husband and wife can be able to send a unified message to their children regarding values and other significant aspects of life. It's possible to have virtually total control over church, not by exerting or altering a church, but by finding a church that teaches the same things you do and allowing your children to participate in just that. Now, similarly, you can have greatest control over the school, and not by telling teachers what to teach, but by finding a school that teaches and reinforces the things that you want. To find such a school might mean your children would go to a private school. The ultimate private school, one that you would definitely have total control over, would be a home school. And there are thousands of families who teach their children at home, millions actually by now, especially through the elementary school years. In a home school, parents have total control or almost total control because they decide the curriculum, choose the text, and so on. The option of homeschooling your children helps parents gain control over what your children are exposed to. But this option isn't available for every set of parents. Now, unless you're really into censoring things, you won't have total control over your children and exposed to in the media. And you cannot completely control who their friends are and what they learn from their friends. You'll have very little control over government policies. Let me give you an example. In most high schools today, regardless of the area they're in, your children are exposed to somebody who might use drugs or chemicals, who might be promiscuous sexually, and so on. On one occasion, I asked a group of 16 to 18-year-old girls how many had friends who had had sexual experience and who talked about it. And out of the 10 girls in the class, if my memory is correct, 8 of them did. That means that your daughter, even though she's not sexually experienced, is being exposed to a peer who has been and who's talking about it. Now, the impact of your family can become more important and powerful than any other socializer, especially in the long term, if you're willing to make it so. There may be short periods of time when friends will have some greater influence, but if you're bonded with your children and have a loving, nurturing home, then your family will be the most powerful socializer. And if you make yourself a teacher where you're teaching about the world, about your religious beliefs and so on, then that adds influence. And please remember, your family is the first social institution your child encounters. He who teaches first often teaches the most effectively. Now, researchers I've mentioned have looked into many parental qualities to see which ones seem to make a difference in terms of how parents develop their children. Many believe there are 3 qualities that account for most of the differences. The first is the amount of control parents exert over their children. It can vary from very little to total, or attempt to be total. The second quality is the amount of warmth parents show to children. It varies from a lot to hostile to loving. And the third quality is the amount of anxiety parents have regarding their role as parents. It varies from high anxiety to low anxiety or calm. Now, here's what we've learned. This is what research is telling us, and this is what common sense tells us. We are learning that when parents, for example, establish kind of a mentoring relationship with the children, and they work together as partners when they're a 2-parent family, then children are more likely to be socialized according to the values and the expectations of the parents, because the parents mentor them, teach them, spend time with them, show them how applications occur, and maintain warm, affectionate bonds with their kids. We've also learned that when parents are too controlling, when they are rigid in their response to the kids, they often kick off 2 forms of behavior: extra compliance by their kids, or the appearance of compliance, and some opposition in their other kids. So excessive control. So the control has to be a balanced form where gradually, as children mature, parents involve the children in making more decisions with them, and then eventually making more of their own. It's a very powerful concept. And then we have also learned that if there's a positive and warm climate maintained by the parents with the children, and with father and mother participation in their lives, then the children tend to refer to their parents affectionately and feel closely attached to them in a secure attachment. So here's what you do on a practical basis. Suppose you work hard to build a conversation relationship with each child, a challenge for many parents. But let's suppose you do that and you tell them that you want to learn about what the kids are doing and what their experiences are like. So you're not trying to interrogate them to control them, you just would like to know so you could share life with them. So then from time to time you ask kids, Even if you had to have a formal interview with them once a month, please try this out. So you're asking your children what they learned at school, who they met and talked with, and so on. You compliment them about their own performance, what they're doing, and so on. Now, it isn't just about personal behavior you want to be acquainted with. Please ask about the situations that your children are in, an experience, little social situations, conversation in the hall at school, playtime at recess, and all the other things with friends and teachers and so on that might occur. So did you talk to your teacher today? What did that teacher say and do? What did you? That's good. I really like that. Okay, and then let's talk about this some more. I really enjoy talking with you. So we're actually going to do things that allow us to keep in contact with our children. Okay, next we're going to set up family conversations or activities like religious education or any other project that involves all the kids so that everybody participates pleasantly and calmly, or sometimes even under a little duress where kids don't want to, but parents say, yes, you do, need to. And you do that as a family so that you build family unity. It's the idea of including and involving your children and at the same time learning to individualize them. It's a difficult task, probably one of the most difficult in all parenthood. We also want to adopt a disciplinary approach where we're highly busy preparing kids to successfully meet the challenges they're going to face, so we prepare more than we punish, so that we aren't busy doing something on our own. Our children make mistakes, then we punish them, and so on, which is the old traditional method. Move away from that if you can and move to, what are our kids going to need? Like they're going to need more decision-making skills in junior high, teach them while they're in the 6th grade. That is an example. In addition to that, you want to make communication and opportunities to communicate more than control attempts, so that you can have a chance to keep your children aware of you and that they believe that you understand and care to know what they're thinking. Very powerful concept, and the time you spend doing that and reinforcing it over the years produces huge, huge results. It's like putting a lot of money in a safety or a bank account where your money's safe, and then it becomes a reservoir for influencing children. Well, why do that? Because at some time in the future, your kids are going to ask to do something you don't want them to do, but you don't have a good reason for them not to, and you're just going to have to look at them and say, please trust me. And then the last thing I want to talk about on this episode is the idea that when you build a relationship with your children that lasts over time, please consider the following 3 things. We want to communicate a lot. I've already mentioned that. We want it to be warm and affectionate, and we want trust to exist so that we will say what we'll do and do what we say. And if you can teach your children those 3 qualities to participate with you, then it serves them well when it comes time to face moral dilemmas, and they're going to choose between what you believe to be right and wrong, and to choose to help somebody or to harm them. It comes from establishing that kind of relationship with your kids. Now, from my perspective as a practicing family psychologist, and I'm not sure how accurate it is for anybody but other than what I see, at least from that point of view, we are seeing a much greater need for us to do these things in our families in order to protect and to promote the successful growth and development of our children.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit FirstAnswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.